Well, look what day it is. Geeky choreographer in the chat. Hello. The one, J. Michael C. in the house. Maybe that's it. Lagnus has arrived. From an undisclosed outpost on the edge of a dystopia, it's finally Friday with me, Steven Schleicher. Tonight's episode, a gun, a city, and a camera. Finally Friday is being brought to you this week by patrons everywhere, and you can become one of those great patrons and one of those cool people by signing up at patreon.com/Major Spoilers. Happy Friday, everyone. We have made it once again to the end of the week. And we are sitting here once again, I like that, from an outpost on the edge of a dystopia. This is finally Friday. And things are getting, I don't know what's going on with that. What is going on with my beard? Everything is so crazy. I'm getting a mullet in the back. Haven't been to a hair cuttery since February. Probably won't go until probably now August. Now that there are increased spikes and increased problems with the coronavirus, I have found out that most of the classes that I will be teaching in the fall will not even meet face-to-face because of this. There were a couple of classes I had to push for what are called hybrid models. It's where you maybe meet occasionally, but you need to keep that contact fairly low. And, of course, these spikes have closed down once again Texas and Florida. New York says it's going to be remained closed, including movie theaters, which is why Warner Brothers has pushed the Christopher Nolan Tenet movie another 2 weeks. Now, August, maybe. I'm going to bet we don't see it in August. I'm going to bet. And here's Warner Brothers' justification. Look, if we can't, they basically said the studio pushed Tenet to July 31st earlier this month to give theaters 2 additional weeks to open and to get operations running smoothly under safety protocols, but now it's delaying the Christopher Nolan release until August 12th. I know that Christopher Nolan has said, hey, this movie needs to be a big screen thing. Christopher Nolan is one of those people that really believes in film, really loves film. I don't know what format he shot this on, if it was in IMAX or if he shot this in 70 millimeter or 35 millimeter. I'm pretty sure he did not shoot it on digital. I think he is one of those few people that still believes in the film process. One of those die-hard people that think that the only way to experience story is on a big screen. But everyone else is slowly tapping their fingers and saying, but for how long? How long before they finally give up on trying to get this into the big screens? And because Cuomo said, hey, we're not opening movie theaters in New York, just in New York. That was enough to spook WB in the hopes that this movie is going to be a $1 billion movie. That if they can't get New York, even if the rest of the country is opened up and movie theaters are opened up, they're like, no, we need to wait another couple of weeks because we need to make $1 billion. And if New York is going to draw in that much money, imagine what those of us in flyover country, or how those of us in flyover country feel when we're not included in the hoi polloi of East Coast and West Coast. My bet is come August 12th, this movie's going to be pushed to Labor Day weekend. And my guess is Labor Day weekend will roll around and they're going to say holiday release. That's just my guess right now. But once again, as a reminder, I'm following Spike Lee's recommendation, not going back to a theater until they find a vaccine for coronavirus. And honestly, I think you probably should too. In fact, I would probably say go out there and wear your masks. We're wearing our masks again, even though in Kansas right now it is not mandated. People did give us strange looks today as we had to go and make a couple of stops into some places. The whole family wearing masks, people looking at us strange. But hey, remember, masks are not only there to protect me, but they're there to protect you. So maybe you should wear some masks too. And if we can get this all under control, if we can all get it contained, if we can all let this virus either die out or find a cure for it, then maybe we can go and see Tenet in the movie theaters. But I'm not holding out hope. I'm not holding out hope. Let's see. Next year it will come out, says Wolf Glenn. I love film. I also love life, says Lagnus. At some point they will decide to grab some money rather than none. Release it now on stream, says Lagnus. I'll go post-vaccine and see it again, I swear. Oh, stupid Nightbot. I gotta go get that fixed. Hey, totally breaking the rules at work to watch you. Oh, just the red. Don't break rules at work, especially if you are actually at a physical location. Hopefully, if you're at home working from home, they can't watch you there. Unless I'm waiting for that point where those people that have desk jobs, if this continues, I'm waiting for that point where employers make you install an app so they can just randomly check in on you at your desk to make sure that you're actually there and doing work. Well, that's a dystopia for another time. Why am I calling major spoilers the dystopia or the outpost on the edge of a dystopia? That came up from a conversation that Matthew and I had last night during the Dueling Review podcast that we do live on our Twitch channel, or I'm sorry, over at our Discord server in the Dueling Review section. Somebody said, "Oh, Steven, you should be pretty proud of this media empire that you've built." And I said, no, it's more like an outpost on the edge of a dystopia. So that's probably what we're going to be calling it for quite some time, unless somebody decides to buy us out for a couple $1 million. And by a couple $1 million, I mean it has to have at least 2 digits in those millions. So there you go. Let's see. Dangerous Rebel you are. So what else is going on? I always see live things when I wake up in the morning, strange messages in Discord without context. There you go. Well, that's what happens. 8 o'clock p.m. Central Time. So adjust your calendars and your clocks accordingly, your time machines, so that you can join us when we sit down and record live. The last couple of weeks, since we have had no more Flash episodes, we've been sitting around just chatting about general things and seeing what topics pop up. A couple of weeks ago I think we did an extra 45 minutes of just talking with fans. And those aren't recorded, so you're never going to be able to hear those. So something to look forward to. And I believe that is only available for patrons. Am I correct on that one? Yeah, Dueling Review. It's only available for our patrons, silver level and higher. So if you're not already a silver level patron, what are you waiting for? All these cool things that are going on and things that we're doing. We're so close to hitting a secret goal. I think we're like $6 away from a secret goal. We have to hit it by the end of the month and it has to be registered into the next month. We hit that secret goal, Matthew and I are going to go do something fun. Anyway, this week we released a new Top 5 podcast. Hopefully you had a chance to listen to the Top 5 podcast. You can find it on most of the awesome podcast aggregators. Stitcher, the other one, the Apple Podcasts. Apple Podcasts is where you're going to find it the most. Top 5 is a show where we just count things down from number 5 to number 1 in a variety of topics. And this week, it was a revisit of a topic from 5 years ago called the Top 5 Books We Are Reading, or that we've read recently. And I did the most 5 recent books that I had read as of that recording. And what's funny is we recorded that maybe a month ago, I want to say. I know we recorded it in May, and it just is coming out now. Maybe it was like 2 or 3 weeks ago. So maybe it was the 1st of June. I'd have to go back and see the actual record date. But at the end of the show, I rattle off a bunch of books. And of those lists of here's what's coming up next on my reading list, I've already blown through more than half of those and added a few more on. And a couple of the things that brought me into this week's topic: A Gun, a City, and a Camera. Two things. Number one, I started reading the Nate Heller detective series from Max Allan Collins. The first one is True Detective, and the other one is called True Crime. Those are the first two in the Frank Nitti trilogy. And I do want to get to the third one, but I'm reading another book right now. I'll get to that in just a moment. And then I'll probably get to that third book and then to see if I want to go on and read the rest of the Nate Heller series. In addition to that, last week, I think it was last week, HBO launched the new Perry Mason series that you can watch on HBO Max. Now, this Perry Mason series is not Perry Mason the lawyer, but Perry Mason as a detective, which doesn't make sense because Perry Mason, all the time, even though he acts as a detective, he's always been a lawyer. He most certainly is not a lawyer in this series, but this is Depression-era detective noir stuff. And the first episode's actually pretty good. It's kind of a little disturbing because there's the death of a child that needs to be investigated. But it is really, really good. And then, of course, I've been watching some Watchmen on HBO, and that has a very noir feel to it. On Wednesday night this week, we weren't recording any episodes, and so I had a chance, after I did the lunchtime game time stream, to just kind of take an afternoon off and hang out with the family. I cooked a bunch of chicken wings and some tater tots, and we ate and had fun and decided I would just sit around and watch a couple of movies. So I ended up watching Chinatown and LA Story, both, these neo-noir detective movies. And that got me thinking that I'm really on this detective bent right now. So why don't I recommend some movies, some detective noir movies that you might get a kick out of. Maybe you've seen, maybe we've talked about on Zach on Film when we were doing that. And I decided, instead of just, here's 10 random noir films that you should check out, I had some specific things that I wanted to do with this list. Number one, it had to be like crime drama, right? Had to have some kind of detective work going on. It had to have some kind of conspiracy thing going on. Number two, all the movies have to be set in and around Los Angeles, California. And number three, I picked one movie per decade, so that if you watch these in their decade order, not their release order, but in their decade order, you could kind of see LA grow and change over those time periods. So, what do we got here? So I'm gonna share with you, what do we have? Nine movies on this list. Why LA specifically? There's something about LA. LA. Well, so let's start off with the 1930s. Of course, the movie that I picked is Chinatown. J.J. Gittes has been hired to do some sleuthing work to see if this woman's wife or this woman's husband is cheating on her. Turns out that he was set up, and it's really a story about finding a girl, and it dives deep into the California water wars of the 1920s and 30s, which are real events. So when you watch Chinatown, all the stuff that's going on in the background, the whodunit part, the big reason for the crime, these are things that actually happened in Los Angeles in the 1930s. Now, obviously, J.C. Cross and Mulray are fictional characters in this piece, as is Jake Gittes. But the history behind that is really, really cool. And so that brings me to the book that I'm currently reading in between the Nate Heller books. Nate Heller takes place in Chicago. Chinatown, of course, takes place in LA. And I'm reading, the book that I am reading right now is called, now let me pull it up. I should have had this up. It's called The Big Goodbye. And it's about the making of Chinatown. And I know a lot of people don't like Chinatown because of Roman Polanski and what happened after that movie. And I agree with you. Roman Polanski is one of those people that you have to look at and say, man, I wish justice would be served. I wish there was some stronger extradition. I wish more people would continue to not let him make movies, even though he's doing that in Europe, and some of those movies get shipped here to the United States for people to watch. But Chinatown, written by Robert Towne, is so good and so detailed that in the book they're talking about why LA is a perfect setting. Because when LA grew, it grew so fast that even in its traditional grid system, it got messed up really quickly. And instead of growing out from a city center, which, today we would say downtown LA, but even that is not a city center where people can go and congregate, almost like a Central Park in New York, or a plaza area or the town center area in Kansas City. There's nothing like that in Los Angeles as it was growing. And so what ends up happening is, as the city expands and we start to get into, then followed by the water corruption and controversy, we ended up with the LA highway system, which LA grew so quickly they couldn't keep up with the traffic, so the highways came in. And what ends up happening is people keep getting more and more distant from one another. In a city like Chicago, in a city like New York, you can walk from place to place or use a public transit system. And in Los Angeles, you really can't do that easily because the city is so spread out, the city is so wide that everyone is isolated. And in noir movies, isolation is a big theme. So if you're asking why LA gets picked as this, that's the reason why. Isolation. Things that change abruptly. Things that we're not comfortable with. Things that we're not familiar with. Things that seem out of the ordinary. And when you get into my 1940s pick, Farewell, My Lovely, this was released in 1975, directed by Dick Richards. Farewell, My Lovely is a Philip Marlowe story that doesn't feature Humphrey Bogart, right? I know a lot of people think, oh man, how come Maltese Falcon isn't on your list? That movie doesn't take place in Los Angeles, it takes place in San Francisco. But this is a Philip Marlowe story that takes place late in Philip Marlowe's life. And this is one that harkens back to pre-Code era movies. Now, we've talked about the Hollywood Hays Code on Finally Friday before, and how it was a kind of a rules system, a morals guide to producing movies. But after the MPAA came around in the 1960s and they said, hey, instead of the Hays Code, how about we use a rating system and let people make up their own minds? Then the Hays Code kind of fell apart and people started injecting more risque items, more hardcore items. And in the case of Farewell, My Lovely, which is an adaptation of the book by the same name, they allowed the seedier parts of that story to be in the movie. Drugs, prostitution, some more, maybe I wouldn't say extreme violence, but harder violence for the time. This has Robert Mitchum in it, who has played a Philip Marlowe character before. But pre-Code stuff, if you'd seen some detective stuff from like the 1920s, you definitely would have seen sexuality front and center, drug use front and center, those kinds of things you wouldn't speak of front and center. And certainly when we go back to the 1930 version Chinatown, the incest aspect of Chinatown is fairly risque and fairly shocking. So it's not surprising that after Chinatown, we do see Farewell, My Lovely pop into existence. But that's a 1940s version of Los Angeles. For the 1950s, this one was tough because there are some very good movies that are set during the 1950s, post-World War II, not too pre-Korean War, but just before Korean War and just before Vietnam War. But I still had to go with L.A. Confidential, 1997's film by Curtis Hanson, which follows the corruption inside the Los Angeles Police Department. Okay, we get to see 3 policemen and see what happens with them. We also get to see the seedier side of Los Angeles in the 1950s as sex, drugs, and just corruption in general are just under the surface. And that I think is something interesting. Now, the interesting thing about L.A. Confidential is that it's based on the book from James Ellroy. Part of his, the L.A. Trilogy, I believe is what it's called. I haven't read L.A. Confidential, but last summer I did read the, what is his most recent book? It's the third part in that series, but it actually comes before L.A. Confidential. There is a deeper story in L.A. Confidential than what you see on the screen, mainly because of Ellroy's work. So if you really want to know more about these characters, you really need to read the other books in that series to really appreciate what's going on that. But that is a really good example of what I would say is a 1950s neo-noir detective crime movie. Did L.A. get as cockeyed as Hayes? Now, see, Hayes does not have that seedier side. There are some interesting stories, but L.A. has a million more stories than Hayes ever could. L.A. is not very noir friendly. Oh, L.A. is very noir friendly. Correct. I'm reading the Witcher books and a mix of other books, some 40K books. Let's see. I should actually take a look at how the West Coast actually was in the 1930s. Somehow I have this image. It was a big collection of various shack towns and then downtown Hollywood. Yeah, that's why if you watch movies like L.A. Confidential, if you watch movies like Chinatown, you get to kind of see a little bit of that. The 13th Floor, which is not on my list, because it's not really a detective movie, it's a kind of a VR thriller movie. You get to see parts of LA as they might have been, where it's just like long stretches of just open desert, and then all of a sudden a giant hotel. Perry Mason, I think, does a good job of trying to capture downtown Los Angeles in that time. Now, for the 1960s, for movies that are set during the 1960s that fall into this noir category, it was very tough because there are a lot of other things going on in the 1960s that people would rather make films about, namely Vietnam. And because of the sexual revolution and the way things were taking and the flight to the suburbs in the late 50s and early 60s, it's really hard to find noir films set in Los Angeles during this time. But I came up with one. I don't think it's very dark, but it's Harper, starring Paul Newman. And Harper, it came out in 1966, directed by Jack Smite. Harper is an adaptation of one of my favorite detectives of all time, Lou Archer. But for whatever reason, they decided to call him Lou Harper in this movie. But this is an adaptation of, I want to say, The Drowning Pool, if I remember correctly, on this one. And it's okay. It's pretty good. A lot of people really, really like it. Alex Segura, who over there at Archie Comics, he really loves this movie adaptation of the Lou Archer books. I think it's okay. But then again, I've read all the Archer books multiple times. But that is one that is interesting, but it's fairly light. It has some dark themes to it, but it's fairly tame compared to all the other things on this list. Let's see. So now let's roll into the 1970s. Again, some really good movies set in the 1970s, not filmed in the 1970s, but that take place in the 1970s. Oh, so as far as, let me go back to the 1960s. The only other one that I could really kind of come up with that was really kind of a thriller kind of thing would be Zodiac from David Fincher. But the problem is Zodiac takes place in 1969 through like 1978. Also, it doesn't take place in Los Angeles. It takes place in San Francisco. It's all about Ted Cruz's father. You've probably seen that movie. So for the 1970s, I went with one. It's one of these movies that I can't stop watching. I'll just get this itch that it's like, oh man, I want to watch this movie again, because every time I watch it, I find something new and interesting about it, something new and interesting about the performers. It's 2014's Inherent Vice by Paul Thomas Anderson. Again, another adaptation of a book, but it follows private detective Larry Sportello, as he tries to find a missing girlfriend. And this guy is on drugs all the time. This movie has to deal with drugs. There's a lot of conspiracy things that are going on, a lot of criminal activity that is going on, mob activity that's going on. And it is really, really good. It's got, what's his name? Joaquin Phoenix plays Doc in this movie. And it's really good. It's also got Thanos in it. What's his name? What's his name? Josh Brolin in it as well, as kind of the heavy. Not the bad guy, but a heavy in the movie. Kind of an antagonist to Sportello. But it's really good. And I think it really gives you a look at Los Angeles 1970s. Not Saturday Night Fever. I don't know what you guys are talking about. All right, now let's get into the 1980s. A lot of good movies that take place in the 1980s that are kind of noir. But the one that I'm going with is 1984's Body Double from Brian De Palma, which is essentially his homage to Alfred Hitchcock, both with Rear Window and Vertigo. It's basically those two movies smashed together. About an actor who is obsessed with peeping. He's a peeping Tom. And he sees a woman across the way doing very sexy things in the window, and he becomes obsessed with her. And then he sees her being murdered and thinks she's dead, and he's distraught, and the police think he did it. Until he has to figure out the whodunit part, and that's where the Vertigo part comes in. So yes, it's very much Vertigo meets Rear Window. Body Double by Brian De Palma. A lot of people don't like that film, but it really, I think, captures not only the vibe of the early 80s Los Angeles, but it's also kind of dark and gritty and disturbing at the same time. For the 1990s, I went with something fairly light. I think everybody knows which one I might be talking about. It's The Big Lebowski from the Coen brothers. It came out in 1998. The dude, Lebowski, has been kind of hired. He's got mistaken identity, but he's been hired to track down what happened to this the big guy, what happened to his young wife and the conspiracy that unrolls around that. Also, he's trying to get back his ruined rug. So The Big Lebowski from 1998. Go check that out. I think that's a pretty good indicator of 1990s Los Angeles. For the 2000s, I really didn't want to go with this one, but I don't think that there is a better example of noir detective 2000s Los Angeles than 2005's Brick by Rian Johnson. Now, I watched this the first time, and I had to turn it off halfway because I thought it was kind of stupid in the fact that Rian Johnson was having all of these high school kids talk like they were in a 1940s detective movie. And then finally I said, okay, let me just get through it. And it's a pretty okay movie. It's got very dark themes of loss and isolation, kind of like what all of these movies have with them. You don't get to see too much of Los Angeles in the movie, but you do get to see a lot of what I would say is higher society kind of stuff. There's some things that take place in some mansions, some things that take place in the sewers of Los Angeles. So Brick from Rian Johnson is probably a good movie to go and check out as a representation of 2000s Los Angeles. Now, I've got some others. Don't worry. I've got some alternates on here. And for my final movie that takes us all the way through the 2010s, I'm going to see if anybody has a guess. What is the movie that I would pick as this neo-noir detective movie set in Los Angeles that takes place in the 2010s? Anybody have an idea? Yeah, but see, Shane from Canada says, the first thing you said when Detective LA 2000s, I thought of Angel, the TV show. But we're not talking about TV shows. We're talking about movies. Geeky Choreographer says she's got nothing. Maltese Falcon is not it. That's number one. I said that earlier. San Francisco takes place also in the 30s. Something from the Coens? No. This one's going to flip everybody's lid. The Brad Pitt movie. Now, Seven doesn't take place in the 2010s. It's a very good contender. And the cool thing about Seven is you don't realize that it's Los Angeles until the end of the movie. That'd be a very, very good contender. Black Dahlia doesn't take place in the 2010s, take place in the 1940s. So definitely not the Black Dahlia, although that is another good movie to watch. That's a movie about obsession. But that is a very good movie if you're looking at noir movies that take place in the 40s, not the year that they were released, but take place in the 40s that fall into this crime area. Yeah. So again, the whole point as we get to the 2010s is, number one, how we got here is all the movies on this list. The movie takes place in that decade. Number two, it is considered noir or neo-noir. And number three, it has to have a crime, drama, thriller bent to it. Pulp Fiction took place in the 1990s. For the 2010 movie, that is a great example of the noir thriller that takes place in Los Angeles, 1982's Blade Runner, directed by Ridley Scott. Based on the Philip K. Dick novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Blade Runner takes place in the year 2019, November 2019, as these androids, these replicants, come back to Earth, where they've been banned from, and try to find their creator, or try to find meaning, or try to figure out a way to extend their life. And we get introduced to Deckard, who has been tasked with bringing the replicants down. He is a Blade Runner. And a lot of people forgot, and I know it's crazy times out in the world, but a lot of people forget that Blade Runner takes place in November of 2019 Los Angeles. And it most certainly is set in Los Angeles. So here are my alternates. From the 1940s, from the decade, and again, the movie set in the 1940s, Double Indemnity from Billy Wilder. That one is a really good one with, what's his name, Fred McMurray in it. My Three Dads, also the model, the original model for Shazam. That one's really good. I like that one a lot. Also, Devil in the Blue Dress from 1995 from Carl Franklin, featuring... What's his name? Now I forgot his name. I actually read this book after watching the movie. Denzel Washington, that is correct. Thank you for the help there. Well, that is set in 1948, is when that movie is set. For the 1950s, you can find this if you know where to look. I had a chance to watch this just the other day. It's Kiss Me Deadly, which is a Mike Hammer movie based on the Mickey Spillane novel. I don't know if it is a direct adaptation of that, because the ending, the MacGuffin in this movie is, boom, blew my mind when I saw the end of this movie. It's like, what if Pulp Fiction and Raiders of the Lost Ark had a grandfather that they never knew about, and it was Kiss Me Deadly, where Mike Hammer picks up a hitchhiker on the side of the road. She ends up turning out dead, and everyone is telling him to forget all about her, and he has to figure out who she was, and that leads to a MacGuffin in a box. That is pretty crazy. That ending is crazy. That is Robert Aldrich, if you want to try to track that down. Came out in 1955. Again, 1960s movies, very hard. The closest I came to another alternate would be Zodiac. And that is, again, set in San Francisco between 69 and 77 or 78. But an alternative movies, or a couple of alternative movies for the 1970s, is 2016's The Nice Guys from Shane Black. Takes place in the 1970s as a missing girl and a dead porn star and a private detective. Two private detectives team up to try to take down a cartel that is essentially trying to suppress technology for the auto industry. From 1973, Robert Altman's The Long Goodbye. Now, and this is really weird, is that Philip Marlowe, it's another Philip Marlowe story. It brings Philip Marlowe from the 1940s and basically sets the stories in 1970s Los Angeles, and it's got Elliot Gould in it. I personally hate this movie, but a lot of people really, really, really love Elliot Gould in The Long Goodbye, so maybe I have to go back and give it a revisit. But the first time I watched it, I totally despised it. I thought the ending was dumb. I thought it didn't make sense. I thought that it did not follow... I mean, it follows the book almost exactly, but I didn't like how they did it. I didn't like how they just took this 1950s story and transported it to the 1970s. Maybe that's the thing that I don't like about it. For the 1980s, two other movies that you might want to check out that are set in the 1980s, To Live and Die in L.A. This is the one that has a Secret Service agent trying to track down a counterfeiter. I believe it's by the same guy who did The French Connection. And it stars Willem Dafoe and the guy from Red Dragon and from the CSI Las Vegas show. I forget what his name is off the top of my head. And then another movie that you could check out, set in the 1980s, that has kind of a detective, that obviously does have a detective bent to it. I don't remember if this one is set exactly in Los Angeles, but it is set in Southern California, and that's the Coen Brothers' Blood Simple. So, there you go. Michael Mann. Neuromancer happens in Tokyo. Neuromancer takes place in a space station over the Earth. Is that the one I'm thinking of? Or am I thinking of Snowfall? I forget which one. Yeah, in the space station. Plus, they also jump over to Europe and a bunch of other stuff as well. Oh, so there's another person. Squirrel Brian also hates The Long Goodbye. Okay, so Squirrel Brian, tell me why we both hate The Long Goodbye. Also, again, partly because these films had to be set in Los Angeles. They were not, I could have picked a bunch of European films. I could have picked a bunch of other international films. But because I specifically wanted to set it in Los Angeles, there are not a lot of international films that take place in LA unless they're English releases. And these are some of the English releases. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that list. And if you haven't, maybe since you're stuck at home and you're not going to be going anywhere for a while, and movie theaters won't be opening again for a while, maybe this will give you a chance to sit down and watch some of these movies if you've never seen them. I think all of these are very watchable movies. The only one you're not going to be able to get a hold of easily is Farewell, My Lovely. But the guy who plays Mike Hammer in this movie, very, very good. I really like his physical build. Now, the acting in the movie, not so good. But overall is a very interesting movie. Why is there always a Neo Tokyo or a New Kyoto? Okay, so if you really want to know this, my wife's home. I don't have to pick up kids. So let's go into a deep dive of the rise of Neo Tokyo. When we look at the cyberpunk genre came out in the early 80s, right? William Gibson, and I forget who the other author was, that was really starting to get into and introduce the notion of cyberpunk. But cyberpunk comes from this notion that the U.S. was becoming a dystopia anyway. Certainly the 1970s economic crash and the gas crisis, plus Reaganomics, further depleting the United States of America, meant that the dollar was relatively low, which meant that everyone else could come over here and buy goods and services super cheap compared to their monies. And one of the things that was happening during the late 70s and early 80s is Japan had a huge explosion in their economy. There was so much growth going on in Japan at this time, a lot of it a little bit overinflated from the economy side, but these guys were going out and spending thousands of dollars to entertain business partners, or after work, it was very easy to just take the company credit card and go rack up thousands and thousands of dollars at the bars and the singing, what's it called? The karaoke bars, right? And one of the things that was happening also at this time was that we were importing heavily a lot of Japanese goods, right? We had the rise of the Japanese automobile, because people weren't buying American cars because they were too much gas guzzlers and we were trying to save on the money. And the other thing that was happening is that Japanese businessmen were buying up real estate all across the United States. And because of that, there was this fear, probably mixed with xenophobia, that we were going to be overtaken by the Japanese, and that the Japanese would eventually own everything, just because of how strong their economy was in the late 70s and early 80s. We kind of saw this happen again in the 2000s with Saudi Arabia and the princes who were, buying up, just Saudis in general, who were buying up a lot of stuff because of the wealth that they had. But this kind of fear kind of helped stoke this idea of a dystopia where the real power was centered in this new Tokyo or this new Japan. And so everyone believed, or at least in cyberpunk and the general culture at the time, everyone believed that the center of the universe was going to move from New York to Tokyo. So when we have our cyberpunk writers coming along, they are situating a lot of their stories in Japan and in those cities to kind of reinforce what they saw as the future of the world. Of course, unfortunately, by the end of the 80s, the Japanese economy collapsed. And that was not something that came about or came to power. So that is my very surface level remembrance of how we got cyberpunk and how we got how Japan became the center of cyberpunk stories, is because of our xenophobia of Japanese taking over America through their strong economic prosperity in the 1980s. So there you go. 2000's Christopher Nolan's Memento will work if you want to do that, although it's not specifically set in Los Angeles. It's set in Southern California. Let's see. What else do we have here? Doodly-doodly-doo. Yeah, so Lagnus is basically, that's the story. Malone says mainly because Japan looks super futuristic in the 70s and 80s. Yes, Bruce Sterling. I think he's the one that actually coined, if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure Bruce Sterling is the one that coined the phrase cyberpunk. Or maybe it was Neil Stephenson, I forget which one. But you're right. Neil Stephenson, Bruce Sterling, and William Gibson were basically your three godfathers of the cyberpunk culture. Now in China, I would kind of agree with you with your comment there, Malone, about now China is essentially the Neo Tokyo, except that in Tokyo, in the strong economy of that time period, I don't want to say everybody, but a larger portion of the population was enjoying the wealth than the smaller part of the population, and that's not currently the case in China, although there is a growing middle class. The other thing that's interesting about China, and your comment on that, is the fact that China expects growth, so they build these cities, these huge cities, expecting people to flood in there, and then nobody comes to them. And so you've got these like essentially ghost cities. There's some really good articles online if you go and look up the ghost cities of China, where essentially you have, hundreds and hundreds of skyscrapers, huge apartments, business districts, all these things that were built in anticipation of people coming out, and then nobody comes out, so they're just kind of left empty. And, a city that's supposed to hold 100,000 or 1 million people, I think in China, I think their smallest city is supposed to be like 1 million people in some of these ghost towns, and something like 100,000 show up. And it's pretty creepy. Let's see. What else do we have here? Also strong lines of misogyny, let alone xenophobia ideas, where the power was money and total lack of ethics in Gibson's work. While I liked his ideas, sometimes his stories really made me uncomfortable to read. I would not disagree with you. Let's see what else. Lagnus says, I enjoy them all. I have a dedicated signed book of the newest Gibson on the way. Nice. How does everyone feel about Philip K. Dick? I think he's very hit and miss. Some is great, but some is blah. I think most of his books are fairly blah because they really expect you to be in a different headspace, much like Philip K. Dick was at that time period. And if you're talking about Philip K. Dick movies, it's super hard to adapt a Philip K. Dick movie just because of the things that are going on in those books and how so much of it is cerebral. And so much of it is an altered plane of thinking that it's hard to translate from a book into his movies. Uh-oh, Brian. Squirrel Brian has used a foul language. Oh, but Lagnus is slipping me $20. Oh. Ah, Philip K. Dick. I get it. Way to go. Wait, was that Nightbot or Autobot? Automod. All right. I think that is where we will wrap it up this week. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Good literature is supposed to make you uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable in a skeezy way. Like, I think I've talked before, I don't have a problem with nudity, pornography, people's sexual orientations do not bother me in the least. Whatever you like to do, that is up to you, and go for it. But at the same time, sometimes I will read books like the Dresden Files, and there are 2 Dresden Files books coming up, one in July and one in September, that there are portions of those books that make me feel uncomfortable because it's very heavy male gaze-ish. Got a very heavy male gaze throughout, and that makes me feel uncomfortable when I'm reading those books. So that is opposite of, let me present you with an idea of someone like, what's the detective's name in A Devil in a Blue Dress, played by Denzel Washington, where you are forced to look at what does it mean to be a black person in 1940s Los Angeles and what the harassment and abuse and killing that was going on. And that makes you feel uncomfortable because it's talking about your place and your position and your privilege. So yes, in that case, literature can make you feel uncomfortable, and that can be good because it makes you think about where you're at. But if it is something that is like, oh, this is something that is not offending me, but literally makes me feel uncomfortable, rapey, or whatever, I don't think that is good. All right, a lot of fun, says Geeky Choreographer. Definitely have some stuff to look out for while working at home. Yes, I agree with you, just the red. Cyberpunk is very much a no good guys thing often too. Yeah, well, and you're going to find as you watch these movies that all of the characters in these movies are not, there are no black and white heroes, right? There are shades of gray. What is in it for me? Sometimes I will do things with the quote unquote bad guys, and some things I will do things with the quote unquote good guys. All right, everybody, that will wrap it up for this week's show. I think people are starting to get into some good discussions there. It was Glasses Guy who you're thinking of. Now you made me forget his name. But yes, in LA Confidential, Crow was definitely on the side of the corrupt police. Basically, he was a heavy. He was a thug beating people. While Exley was the supposed good cop who still had some very gray sides and some things that he was more looking out for himself while he was doing good. Because he did some very bad things in that movie, but spun it in a way that made it look like he was good. Rising Sun is probably not a very good example of noir movies, especially the movie, because it's just horrible from so many different angles. Judge Dredd also not set in Los Angeles, so there you go. All right, thank you so much. This time we are getting out of here. Let's take a look at all the people that helped make this happen. If you would like to make this happen as well, just head over to patreon.com/majorspoilers. Thank you so much, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the show this week. Go check out those movies. Don't be a dick. Do good. Be good. Wear a mask. And we will see you next time when it's finally Friday.